Shogun is airing on Hulu, and after the first episode, the show is off to a pretty good start. There's a bunch of interesting characters, there's a lot of politicking. It does a pretty good job of demonstrating the culture clash between the Portuguese Catholics, the European Protestants, and the Japanese people of this era. I think all the sets look pretty cool. From my limited knowledge of this era of history, a lot of the costumes seem accurate. The way that they're pretty openly racist with each other in different languages is interesting and probably accurate. They all refer to each other as barbarians and savages. I haven't actually read the book for this one, but from what I've heard, they've kept the general spirit of it while kind of toning down the sex and violence. I guess that's because it's airing on FX, and when you get into this era, you run into issues with the ages of people having sex and that sort of thing. Game of Thrones aged up to characters, that type of deal. The first episode reminds me quite a bit of the early Game of Thrones stuff, where you're getting introduced to the world and the people and kind of the politicking going on. And they do this in a really efficient way, and the show is pretty dense. You really have to pay attention the whole time, and especially because all the Japanese stuff is in Japanese, and then when we hear English, it's supposed to be Portuguese in world. There is a dub version, but I'm never really a fan of dubs, and especially for live action shows. Anime can sometimes get away with it, but live action, I feel like it's usually just comical. All right, so let's get into it. Right away, we get a couple of pages of text on the screen that establish the world. 1600, Portuguese Catholics trading with Japan, and they've hidden the location of Japan from the Protestants. And right away, this is something that I guess people now wouldn't really consider, or at least I certainly didn't, that the map of the world was very loose and very unknown. And even if you were aware of different things, you might not be able to actually find them because of limited abilities for transportation and all that sort of thing. So the first page of text kind of explains the one side of this conflict, and the second page explains the Japanese side. So the Japanese side, the reigning Taiko, or essentially emperor, died, and in his stead, he left 5 people to split the power until his kid grew up to an age where he could actually rule. And that way nobody else takes over before his son grows up and kills him. But by taking all the power, they can achieve the title of Shogun. And you can see on screen that would make their power absolute. Right away, we get quite a bit of exposition. This is one of our protagonists, John Blackthorne. And he's talking to the captain of the ship. He's the pilot. And you find out that they've been going around South America, fighting the Portuguese. They ended up in Japan, coming from the Pacific. They had 5 ships and a few hundred men. And now they're down to just a handful of starving men. And the captain kills himself. So pretty dark right away. And this scene was a little bit exposition heavy, but it's pretty dense and it paints the whole picture for them right away. Their boat drifts up to Japan. And this is a huge deal for them because this was their goal. Because these are the English trying to combat the Portuguese because their countries are at war. But like I said on that first page, the Portuguese had been trading with Japan, which was helping them economically and with their war, while also hiding the location from the English. So this small group pretty much gets arrested and just treated like shit by the Japanese. They don't even have anyone who can communicate. Like they had to go find a specific person who can communicate with them. Luckily, John Blackthorne, the main guy, can speak Portuguese, and because the Portuguese are trying to spread their religion here, they have a guy who can speak Portuguese and Japanese. And each episode is referred to a chapter. I don't know if these are straight from the chapters in the book or what, but everyone has it, and this one is Anjin, which means pilot, which is what John Blackthorne is on this ship. Obviously, he's just the navigator. So we see the Japanese decide to arrest Blackthorne and his crew, and they can't communicate with him, and then we cut to another protagonist for the story, arguably the main protagonist, Yoshi Toranaga, who's played by Hiroyuki Sanada, who he's always awesome. And it seems like he's the go-to for Japanese people for Hollywood. He was in John Wick 4, Mortal Kombat, as Scorpion. He's in a bunch of shit. And he's talking to his son, Yoshi Nagakado. I'm sure I'm butchering the names. Sorry. And they're talking about this bird and how it conserves its energy until the time is right, hiding and then strikes. I'm assuming this is foreshadowing. But they're walking, and we don't know what they're going to yet. So they keep walking. We get to see some new people introduced. And these 4 are the other 4 regions that are put in power after the Taiko died, along with Toranaga being the 5th. And we get a little bit of a lecture here from the one in the center whose place this is, Lord Ishido. So he's kind of the one in charge here because they're at his place. And the one on the right behind the screen had leprosy. So 2 of these 4 leaders claim to be very devout Christians now because the Portuguese and their dealings with them. And what we find out during this conversation is that they feel like Toranaga has expanded his power that Toranaga has taken on more concubines, and then he's going to overwhelm the other 4 of them and declare himself Shogun or Taiko or whatever the case is. He says that the heir's mother was taken to his castle at Edo, and he's implying that she's a hostage, and he says that she's not a hostage, she can leave whenever she wants. She was there for the birth of a child. So you can see there's this kind of politicking going on as a vie for power. Because if the other 4 regions vote, essentially they can have Toranaga executed along with everyone under his charge. This is one of Toranaga's men. He gets pissed off that they're insulting him, and he insults Ishido. And instead of it starting a war, because it's a very honor-driven culture, he apologizes and says, let me commit seppuku. So essentially now he has to kill himself and his only kid because he was disrespectful to this lord. And this is something I would imagine a lot of people have a hard time grappling with, but it's also something that's pretty prevalent in a lot of these shows that take place hundreds of years ago, where everything was more about family unit and family lineage than any kind of individualism or anything like that we have in like a modern liberal society. And this is a pretty harsh way to demonstrate it, but right away you realize like, okay, this is not like our world or modern day Japan or anything else. And it really shows kind of the value of honor and respect and all that kind of stuff in this culture. Obviously, I would hope that most people would think to a crazy extreme degree. They agree to let him sit in a prison cell for a few days and try to find a way to defend himself, and then they're going to vote and execute him. And they need all 4 to agree to the decision, and then he has to as the 5th, which he would do because of how honor works in this culture, and that if he refused, it would lead to an all-out war. That's kind of his responsibility as one of the 5 regions. And now he's trying to figure out a way to get out of it, because obviously the whole thing is a farce, and it's just political maneuvering as a power grab. So part of this conversation is Toranaga says that he'll protect the wife of the guy who has to kill himself now, and that it's this guy's granddaughter. And he knows about the ship. I'm not exactly sure how. It seems like it was a weird editing thing, but he asked him, who's his general, to go look into the barbarian ship, because right now it's 4 armies against 1, and that's why this guy's confused. He's like, you're days from execution, and you're worried about some barbarian ship that floated up to the shore. We go back to Blackthorn, and they're having communication issues, obviously, with the people holding them there, and he says that he wants to speak to the village leader on behalf of the men. And repeatedly, he's saying, like, I can't die in this place. I didn't come this far just to die. And he kind of refers to this place as primitive or a shithole or whatever you want to say, which will be relevant to his character later. So we go back. We see the woman whose baby has to be killed now because of her husband, Tadayoshi. She's freaking out. She doesn't want to give the kid up. And Mariko, who I would say is our 3rd and last main protagonist, talks her down. And she's like, enjoy the time with your kid while you can. But killing yourself isn't going to help anything. And I'll just go ahead and say right now that this actress, Anna Sawai, was the main character in the show Monarch Legacy of Monsters, which I have videos for if you want to check them out. And she does more acting in this 2-minute scene than that entire fucking season, which I think is a pretty big indictment on how bad the writing really was in that show. But I don't want to get sidetracked. So we get introduced to her. She's our 3rd protagonist. They finally take John out of the cell. He's getting on their nerves. And one of the Christians, who's Catholic, from Japan, comes up and translates for him, like, knock it off. He keeps saying, we're merchants, and the Catholics want to frame him as a pirate. And the Japanese are kind of unsure, but if they're pirates, they're going to hang him and take their shit. This is Lord Yabushige of this little area. It's his fief, as he refers to it, and he was given this by Toranaga. So John is trying to talk to him through the translator, but the translator is Catholic and lying about everything that he's saying. John figures out what's going on, and he's like, you lied to him, didn't you? And told him that Portugal was the only flag from Europe, which means I'm the first Englishman here. And I like this because it's a nice scene to show how clever he is right away. Like, all the characters being pretty well established pretty quickly. Like, we see Toranaga right away denies that he wants power. He understands that it's political, but he goes along with it, even though we don't know what his plan is exactly. Obviously, Moriko is very sympathetic to this woman who has to kill her kid, which is pretty normal. And we don't know much about her yet. You get more from her in the 2nd episode. And then we see John is pretty clever and kind of good at charming people and kind of navigating a foreign hostile land. John gets taken away, and Yubashige says, we'll kill him in my special way. And we don't know what that is yet. But apparently this is actually not as bad as it was in the books either, which is crazy because it's pretty brutal. This kid is the heir. Toranaga is kind of raising him, and you find out at the beginning of the 2nd episode that the last Taiko asked him to make sure that he grew up and was protected from enemies, because they were very close. And you find out here because the kid wants to play instead of doing his homework equivalent since he's a prince. Toranaga says that he was a hostage until he was this big, which is an adult. He said he was traded amongst his enemies. We also find out that he had a pretty brutal upbringing, and you see that this has shaped his personality. But it's interesting because over and over he denies wanting power, and as of right now, that's how it seems. He seems pretty straightforward, but it also seems like there's more to him, obviously, because he's making plans and trying to fight back, and obviously avoid his execution and the execution of his whole house or the people in his charge or whatever. So the kid is asking about his mom, and he says, yeah, she'll be back soon. He doesn't seem to be lying about it. He talks to his teacher, and she's like, I wonder what Ashido promised the regents to side with him. And they're speculating about what it could be, and he's saying probably my fiefdom. And she goes, it doesn't matter, then he'll kill them next, and the boy, referring to the heir. So she pretty much lays out that this is all a power grab and political maneuvering by Ishido. And then she says to him outright, they don't fear your name, they fear your bloodline. His bloodline is the last shogun, which was 100 years prior. And she says that we need a shogun. And he says, I don't want to do that. And it's interesting because when he says that he doesn't want it, she says, because you're a good man. But right now, we don't need good men. We need a shogun. Which I think is an interesting line for the show. And normally I kind of shit on these vague philosophical things. But this one I actually like because, first of all, it's relevant to the show. And I think it makes sense. It's not just vapid philosophy. Like the idea that they can't afford for a man to be good when it's about to be wartime, and they need a man to step up and take care of business, which means killing a shitload of people and being pretty egotistical and selfish and willing to do what it takes to restore peace by force. I think it's an interesting line because his character, he's said multiple times already, he doesn't want power. He's not trying to expand his power. And as far as we're aware, that's true. Obviously, I don't know how it's going to end, but the idea that people want somebody to take charge who seems like a decent person because so many people in charge are pieces of shit. I think you can look at the really powerful people in our society and see the type of people that get ahead often. I'm sure they're not all bad, but it seems like there's a lot of them. And he keeps saying, I don't want it, I don't want it. And she says, what's going to happen to the boy if you're not around? Because obviously if he doesn't do what he needs to, the kid will die in the ensuing power struggle. We go back to the village. Yuba Shibe had said to grab a different member from the crew since he wanted to talk to John, and they grab one at random. He boils alive slowly over the course of the night. It's pretty brutal, and you can just hear him screaming in the background just constantly this entire scene. I've heard that this is actually shorter than what it was in the book, which is kind of crazy. And we get this little bit of dialogue here. They don't go into the specifics, but this guy apologizes to the girl about what Yuba Shibe has been doing in their village. So it seems like it's part of his fief, but he's kind of abusing his power, is the implication. Like earlier when they were walking John, one of the Christians came up and one of Yuba Shibe's men just cut his head off. So obviously they're ruling with an iron fist. And he's pretty sadistic, boiling this guy alive and just being kind of gross overall. And John doesn't seem to know about his guy being burned alive. He thinks they just took him away, cut his hair, and clean him up and stuff. Obviously can't show this whole scene on YouTube, but she's sent there to be with Yuba Shibe for the night, and instead she kind of starts kissing the boy who apologized and kind of taunting Yuba Shibe. And the implication is that they have a threesome and that he's getting off on listening to the guy boil alive. So obviously completely psychopathic. But again, established a lot of character in a very short amount of time. Yuba Shibe has been on screen for like less than 5 minutes, and we already know who he is. John wakes up completely naked. They've cleaned him up, and he sticks his arm through the door accidentally because he's not used to the different material. Not a super important scene, but a little bit of humor, which is nice after watching a guy get boiled alive. We see Yuba Shibe eating breakfast, and he's like, oh, he was stronger than most Christians. So obviously we know that he's been doing this habitually. He talks about wanting to see someone strong in the face of death and stuff. Obviously he's just fucking crazy. And you can see the people around him are all really scared of him just by the way they look at him, which who could blame him, So Yuba Shibe is talking to this kid. They have some exposition where the kid's dad died a year ago. He's in charge of the village. Yuba Shibe says that he likes how he's been running it. And the kid's like, you're not going to tell Toranaga about all the weapons and stuff we're taking from this barbarian ship. And Yuba Shibe says he's already trapped in Osaka. Kind of who cares, because he knows he's going to die. And the implication is pretty clear that he betrayed him, I think. So now you know he's a psycho and he's disloyal and deceptive. So they have a conversation here because the kid's kind of concerned. And he's like, there's going to be a big war once Toranaga dies. But he lets him kind of talk him through it. And he says Ishido will be the most powerful and he'll probably win the war. And then it gets explained that he'd have to go against the Christians with their Christian weapons. with the implication being that the cannons and guns and stuff are more modern than whatever they have in Japan. And you find out here that this kid is his nephew, and that essentially he's taking this stuff from the barbarians, letting Toranaga die, and then he's going to become an ally to Ishido because he'll be valuable, presumably for the promise of some kind of seat of power in exchange. Hiromatsu shows up, who's Toranaga's general that he sent to go look into the ship, and they have a conversation where he says, "Oh, you weren't going to give these guns to Toranaga? I thought this was all part of his fiefdom." And Yubishibe kind of tries to laugh it off and be like, "Well, this village is my fief." And Hiromatsu goes, "Oh, that's disappointing. I thought you were loyal to Toranaga," and kind of loosely puts his hand on his sword, and then Yubishibe backs down and says, "Of course I am." Now Toranaga is going to get the barbarian and the barbarian's weapons. And the Englishmen and Portuguese also refer to the Japanese as savages too, so they're all insulting each other in their own language. You can see this guy is Portuguese, and he's like, "Oh, this guy's a pirate, just blow his head off." Because he knows that, obviously, he's English, he's an enemy of Portugal. But John is essentially under Toranaga's watch right now, so they can't just do that. So Yubishibe and his men, John, and the Portuguese guy are all headed toward Osaka, where Toranaga is right now. These two talk, and the guy says, "You're not going to make it back to your part of the world," is like the long and short of it. That they do things differently here, and you shouldn't try to play their games. And John is reiterating over and over throughout the first couple episodes that he can't die in this part of the world. They hit a really nasty storm and wreck their shit, and they're forced to go inland. And the Portuguese guy is off somewhere, and they don't know where he is, so John wants to look for him. And obviously, they can't really understand what he's saying and don't particularly care regardless. John gets Yubishibe and a couple of his men to help him go look, and they see the Portuguese pilot at the bottom of the cliff. John says, "Here, why don't you do it?" Essentially trying to use his honor against him, and they realize that he's clever and kind of what he's doing to try to manipulate him. So again, just a nice little thing where we get to see that he is pretty savvy and quick thinking on his feet. But Yubishibe agrees to it because he can't say no in front of his men. Obviously a big flaw with this mentality. The rope breaks, Yubishibe falls and gets hurt. And he's kind of in the water on the cliffside, and instead of trying to save himself, he's going to kill himself with the sword. And John ends up yelling for him. They go down and get the Portuguese pilot. Again, just a really nice way to show how different their cultural values are. That John's reaction was to save him because he's a person, and his reaction was to protect his honor and not die drowning in the sea. Better to kill himself and die by the sword. Mariko has been called to Toranaga's quarters, and Toranaga is asking if she still speaks Portuguese because she's become a Christian, so she's been interacting with the Portuguese and studying it for a long time. And we get some dialogue in here about how she's been there for 16 years when she got married off to his general. They had a kid together, and Toranaga hasn't really talked to her that much. So she says that she can still speak Portuguese at a low level, but he wants her to come when he meets the barbarian, who's John, because he doesn't trust the Christians to translate honestly. It's kind of the implication here. The Portuguese pilot is still alive, and he's kind of laughing at John's naivete for thinking that this part of the world is uncivilized and that only Europe is civilized. And they have a whole conversation where he says that he's going to give the ship's logs to Toranaga because they would indict him and his crew as pirates, essentially, or at least as liars. When he threatens him like this, John picks up a little metal pot and is going to kill him, but he whips out a pistol, which is nice. Everyone in the show is reasonably prepared and smart. He's not making a threat while he's laid up injured without a way to protect himself. And obviously John is willing to do whatever it takes to survive, even if it means beating a guy to death. So that's all nice character stuff that's just very consistent for this first episode. And this is when the Portuguese pilot says, "You thought that Europe was the hilt of civilization. What do you see out there?" And he goes, and you can obviously see there's a ton of boats and people in this big city of Osaka. And John realizes the world is bigger and more developed than he thought it was. And it's not all just full of savages and primitives. And here we get the young guy that has to kill himself and his own kid. Pretty brutal. A culture that I don't think I would ever understand. But I also wasn't born in 1600 Japan. So, and they have the Portuguese guy narrating a quote, seemingly talking to John. He says they have a saying out here that every man has 3 hearts. I'm paraphrasing, but one for his mouth for people to know, one in his chest that's for his close friends, and then one that he must keep hidden from everyone in the deepest, darkest corner if he wants to survive. And while we're seeing this, we're seeing the guy that was translating in the village sending off pigeons. We're seeing Toranaga sending off pigeons. So presumably he's the one who was spying on Yubishibe and let Toranaga know about the ships and kind of what was going on. And when he says the part about the third heart that must be the most hidden to survive, it's showing Toranaga. So again, I'm assuming this is foreshadowing. I don't know. But typically when you have good shows, which this seems like it's going to be, lines of dialogue like this and shots aren't just said for no reason. So I'm assuming there'll be some kind of twist with him later in the season. And we get a nice ending shot of John on his knees bowing to Toranaga with Mariko behind him. So now all of our main protagonists are united. We got one episode to see a little bit of their backstories, their characters, and now here we are to end the first episode. So I think it's a pretty good setup. It's an hour and 10-minute episode, which is pretty lengthy for one episode of TV. And there's some action, not a ton, but there's still violence, there's still sex, all the stuff that they want to use to draw people in. I wouldn't call it the best pilot ever or the most exciting, but they did release 2 episodes at the same time, and the second episode does have more of that stuff to really get you hooked in. The fact that this is a book and there's been a show made of it and then a remake, I'm assuming that the story will be pretty consistent with it and pretty good. So I'm really looking forward to the rest of the season. Curious to see what they do with it. We got a lot of world building and history and character development for one episode. So I appreciate the density that they fit into one episode of TV. That now we know who we're dealing with and what we're dealing with circumstance-wise. And you're not wondering like, well, maybe there's a million directions this show could go. It's pretty clear what each character's goal is as of now. John is trying to get back at the Portuguese and also get home. Toranaga is trying to survive and protect the heir. Mariko, we don't know quite as much about yet. We get more in episode 2. Ishido is trying to make a power grab for himself. And the other regents are also kind of playing that game where the Christian lords are trying to expand their own power as well. So right away, you know pretty much what you need to, presumably for the rest of the season. Obviously, the characters will get more developed as we go on, and you'll find out stuff about them, and things will twist and turn. But as far as setups go, it's a pretty good one. So I don't want to keep going. This video is already pretty long. If you've read the book or watched the show, comment, let me know what you think. I try to respond to everyone who's not just insulting me. Like and subscribe and all that shit. Thanks. See ya.